wanted to share some thoughts that we had about the some of the ideas that were brought up in the recent Rail Country video about the body, and some things that were mentioned in that I had given some thought to and potentially have written down some things about it, but not really done a video on. And one of those was this concept of the thorns and the crown of thorns and the thorns in the garden. And I'll have to do this from memory, so hopefully I don't mess up too many of the details. But the first point that I think, in the way that I'll apply this to other things that I've been thinking about, the first point is that the commands God gives to the man are to be fruitful and to multiply and to have dominion over the earth. He's to steward the earth, take care of it. And when Adam and Eve consume the fruit, the woman is deceived, but God holds the man responsible for listening to the woman. And prior to that, before God confronts them, they hide themselves. And they hide themselves by sewing fig leaves together to make a cover. And they hide among the trees. And of course, we've all seen depictions where, Adam gets one fig leaf and Eve gets 3, or maybe she gets 1 and, her hair does a little bit of the work. But sewing them together to make a covering and hiding them in the trees.
Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid."
I think, the image that we need, that really we should get from that is the garden is full of trees, and they're not trying to disguise themselves as something else. They're trying to blend in with the garden. They're trying to appear as if they were trees, because in their nakedness, they feel ashamed. They feel that they don't belong there. And as they can observe with, the new powers of observation that they've gained from eating the fruit, they see that it's a place full of trees, and they try to disguise themselves to blend in. And of course, God confronts them and asks them, "Who told you that you were naked?" And Adam blames Eve. God holds Adam responsible. And he tells Adam that because of his sin, because of Adam's choices, it's Adam's fault, that the ground will now produce thorns and thistles.
To Adam he said, "Because you listened to your wife, and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return."
The thing that I thought about that was very interesting is, from an evolutionary standpoint, what is the purpose of a thorn? A thorn is a defense mechanism for a plant. It's there to protect the plant. But the thing is that a thorn is a silly defense mechanism for a plant, because a plant is supposed to give forth its fruit, and that is how it survives. Now, the thorn may help the plant itself from being eaten, but it's not a good or helpful thing for the propagation of the species. And the interesting thing about the fruit is that, the question was why do humans have these soft, exposed bodies? And I believe that part of it is that the role of humanity was to lead in sacrifice. And it is for the purpose of self-sacrifice that humans are, in their natural state, very vulnerable. And I think that, that's epitomized in the redemptive work of Christ. But it was also, and I think that, debates about whether or not the fall was necessary, or I don't know if it's so productive. I think it was inevitable, and I think that ultimately it probably was necessary. I think that it was God's plan for them to eat the fruit. Possibly they could have eaten the fruit in an authorized fashion if they had waited, if they had patience. And I've spoken about that before because Adam tells, it says that it was not good that the man was alone. And then God has Adam name all the animals to prove to himself, to Adam, so Adam will understand that none of these is a suitable helper for you. And then he puts him to sleep, and when Adam awakes, he has a wound in his side, but he also has the wound. And the wound is patched up with flesh. But I imagine, there must have been a scar. There must have been a difference that Adam could notice in himself, and also, of course, the presence of the woman. And so it's not good and evil, but it's good and not good. And God gave him a picture of that. But before that, Adam is told that for him and the woman, or maybe it is told after that they are to eat the fruit of the trees of the garden. And that the animals are going to eat the green vegetation. So Adam and Eve are always supposed to eat fruit. And the fruit is a symbol of sacrifice. It's the most painless symbol of sacrifice. It's the lesson that God put forth that humans could have learned without sinning if they had paid closer attention. Because a tree gives forth its fruit, and it's only when the fruit is consumed that the seed is revealed, and the seed can bring forth new life in the form of a new tree. And as Christ said, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it can't produce a crop. So that lesson was there for them to observe if they had paid more attention, if they wanted to. And so why is there thorns? The thorn is because God gave dominion to the man over the earth, and all of the things in creation follow the pattern set forth by the humans. They are designed to do so. And in the moment of the fall, Adam and Eve, are fearful of missing out, fearful of losing their life, of not having what the thing that the serpent is trying to put forth. And what they give up is the willingness to sacrifice And I think that is reflected in all the rest of creation. And so that is why we see in other animals, we don't know what those animals were like that Adam named, or how many of them were. There may have been very few. I think personally there probably was very few. They were the most archetypal of all the animals. And they probably were amazing if you could have seen them. But, within their nature was a willingness to be sacrificed. And, I have often thought that when God gives Adam and Eve the garments of skin, that he did not have to wrestle an animal to the ground. And I've heard people say, like, oh, maybe it was a sheep, because the sheep is so symbolic later on. But, there was one man and there was one woman. And later on, when Noah gets off the ark, you have 4 men and 4 women. And of the clean animals, you have 7 of each type. So when God reorders the world in the way that he does, the animals that are deemed clean, the ones who have not corrupted themselves by following the example of people who have fallen into sin, he brings more of the clean animals, and only 2, one each male and female, of the unclean animals. And so that sets the ratios, as it were, of how many animals and what types are in the world. So we have more prey than we do predators, and that's good. But if there was only one man and one woman, and Adam named these animals, perhaps there was only one male and female of each of those animals. And so if God had to choose to sacrifice a pair of animals to clothe Adam and Eve, it may well have been that it was the extinction of an entire species. He never got to grow and multiply. And in my opinion, if animals were born in a way to follow the order of man, and man was designed to be self-sacrificing, then it would have been a very noble creature that would have offered itself up for a special purpose to cover and to clothe the man and the woman. And that's not something that's written explicitly, but you can imagine that it could be the sort of thing that was a painful memory. And when young Cain and Abel are asking Adam and Eve where they got their clothing, they may have just said that God gave us these garments of skin, and they may not want to have shared all the details. And of course, that's all speculation, but it's in the spirit of the midrash to think about the details that aren't there and how it could have been and how it could have worked out. So that's a thought that I had about that. But when I think about the thorns, the thorn, it doesn't make sense because it's like it's following a pattern of becoming more defensive, trying to protect what it has. And the result of that is that a thorn becomes a pest, and it's not a useful plant. And so when people's property is overrun with thorns and thistles and other types of weeds, weeds are a different sort, but they're a plant that produces seed in such abundance for their own propagation, but the seed is not useful. So they are of high quantity but low quality. But for thorns, the thorns can be these massive things, these sort of vine branches that just grow and grow. They don't want to die. They've created mechanisms to protect themselves, and they hold on to their existence, and they wrap around other things, and they try to not die. And whatever that plant began as, in following the pattern of all the other things in this earth that desperately flee from pain, death, destruction, it becomes a nuisance. And when it infests the ground, that thorn, it's a vine that doesn't bear fruit. And a vine that doesn't bear fruit is one that gets pruned and thrown in the fire. And so, that was, just something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And of course, when we get to the New Testament and the story of Jesus, there was a couple really interesting points that kind of stood out to me. And of course, the crown of thorns is one, but the other one was mirroring that image of the fig leaves, because of course there is the story of Jesus searching this fig tree. And it says that it was out of season. It was out of season for figs, but it had a lot of leaves. And he searches it, and he finds that there's no fruit on the tree. And I actually heard two explanations for this. One was that a fig tree can have these sort of, when it's not the season of harvest, which will be in the fall, a fig tree can grow in the springtime these little buds that will eventually turn into the fruit, but they come first, and then the foliage comes, and then the fruit will develop into the fullness of fruit. But it could be that he was searching for these buds, which are edible. But the other explanation is simply that there are different species of figs, and some of them bear fruit at different times of year. And the way to know if a fig tree will have fruit or should have fruit is by the foliage, because the leaves start out small and fig leaves grow very big. So if the tree had a lot of mature foliage on it, it should be bearing fruit that is ready to eat. And of course, the tree does not have any fruit. And Jesus curses it, and it withers and it dies. And of course, that image of this fig tree that has leaves and looks like a fig tree should, but it bears no fruit, is sort of reminiscent of this picture of Adam and Eve standing among the trees, covered in fig leaves, but they'll never be able to bear figs because they are created for a different purpose. And the sacrifice that a fig tree makes in order to continue is to give up its fruit, and as long as it bears the fruit, you would keep that tree. But if the tree bears no fruit, you get rid of it. And of course, there's a parallel between this, and this is the main thrust of the story, is that it's tied to Jesus cleansing the temple, and he's doing this in regards to cursing the fig tree to call out Israel and the people who are in charge of the temple, because the temple is not bearing the fruit that it ought to. And I listened to a pretty good message about this, speaking of just the corruption of the money changers, and that really The area that he was clearing out was the court of the Gentiles, where the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations, and it had become a den of thieves. And so that was the purpose for which Jesus cleared everybody out. But it's because that spiritual system was not bearing fruit. And of course, that first command that was given to the man and the woman was that they be fruitful and multiply. And there is a spiritual way in which, when Jesus talks later on, talking about the vine that bears fruit, that is very much, in a sense, speaking of spiritual growth and spiritual conversion, and that we are supposed to be, as believers, bearing fruit in our actions, and hopefully as well bringing others in to bear fruit, that we're reaching people and helping them to grow and become part of this connected vine. But I think we should not discount totally the material aspect of it, because you cannot. It's always wrong to go 100% material, but it's wrong to go 100% spiritual as well. And I think that when spirituality becomes divorced from the material, you have an asceticism which looks down on the material means of growth, on marriage, on bearing children, on building physical residence in a community, and all the things that go with that. Like, you can't have just a spiritual existence. You have to have a material existence too. And we should bear fruit in both. And I thought about this because it's just so, and this is because this has been very heavy on my heart, is this way that our society despairs against children and does not value them. And Jesus put he had a great love for children, and he did not want the disciples to forbid the children from coming to him. And he put an extreme burden of responsibility on those who teach the children, and that if they led the children astray, and especially purposefully, knowing what they were doing, that they would have a very, very heavy existence of punishment coming to them, and that it would be better to be cast into the sea with a millstone tied around your neck. And that's such an incredible, image to think of. And I feel like our society and our world is there. And, the antinatalist propaganda kind of seeps into everything. But it has been present in the church as well. In the times where it was thought of as a greater calling, and it's not only Christianity, but many religions that think of it as a greater calling to have, to live a life of celibacy, to not have a family, and that is a lesser thing. You are, on the one hand, either going to deprive yourself of the knowledge of what it is to be a parent, which is, it is the greatest gift that you can know. And the fact that God refers to himself as Father should, for men, you should consider if you want to know God, that you must know what it means to be a father. And of course, you can be a father spiritually in some ways, but there is, the material fatherhood is a sacred thing, and it was the first thing that God commanded for people to do. And perhaps it was in that moment of when his eyes was opened, Adam realizing, and of course we have no idea what the time was between his creation and the fall, but that he realizing that he had not been fruitful up until that point. And if it was a day, that's maybe that's not really the chief concern, but in our society, there's very many people who have not considered that as an option because they've bought into a lot of lies about it. And, and I think about this tree that's cursed. And there was two ways, as I said, that this could have come about. I think on the one is very clearly, if this was a tree that was bearing all the signs of fertility and fruitfulness and had mature leaves and all the indicators of what one would look for, and yet it bore no fruit, that is very much the ideal of our society in when it looks at a woman, and for that sake, because it only cares about the foliage and not the fruit, a woman doesn't even have to be a woman. A man could be a woman. A man could be a tree covered in leaves that bears no fruit. And as long as it's appealing to the eyes and to the senses, our society will say it's a good thing. But the thing is that tree costs something to someone else, and people will devote their time and their attention to cultivating and maintaining a tree in the hopes that it produces fruit. But if a tree will never produce fruit, then not only has it failed in its job to be productive, but it's carried away the ones who are supposed to be doing the work of tending the garden. And of course, there's a male and a female thing there going on there, because it's the man who tends to the tree and the woman is the one who bears the fruit. And so that's why I say that a woman that bears all the marks of fertility and cannot reproduce by choice specifically, that's a very dangerous thing for our world. And of course, the other scenario is this tree that had these little buds, and the buds are plucked off and eaten. And this is, in a sense, if a tree had that, and somebody was cultivating that tree, perhaps they would eat some of those buds, but they would never eat all of them, because if they ate all of them, then the tree would not produce real fruit. And if it does not produce fruit, it does not produce seed. And if it does not produce seed, it does not produce more trees. And so in a sense, this is, an image of what we do to our young people in telling them, before they even really understand the choices that they're making, that we encourage them to rid themselves of the possibility of parenthood. And, the tree is the one that's cursed, but who's responsible for that tree being cursed? It is in many ways the person who's taking care of the tree, that they've not done their job. Obviously, this is a message that, it comes from the devil. And it's the same thing that he's been speaking to people since the garden, and it's what he says in the garden. And, God doesn't give these these curses or these things that God does. For the woman, God is the one who increases the pain. For the man, it's because of his choice that the earth will produce these thorns and that it will require his toil. And the world tells us that those are bad things and that we should give them away. But if we are designed if we were designed for a life of self-sacrifice, then that is our highest goal. And the act of parenthood is one of the most natural forms of self-sacrifice. And I spoke the other day about, how much I admire, and I think our society should admire, those parents who raise children who have special needs. But even in general, it's such a lie that our world tells men that fatherhood is a burden, and women the same thing, that having a child will ruin their life. And it's this thing that you're giving up. For the man, if you have kids, that means that all your hard work is going to feed those mouths, and it's not going to you. And for the woman, having that child's going to ruin your career. It's going to ruin your social life. It's going to ruin all the other things you could be doing. But as I've learned, I was nervous about becoming a father because I didn't know what it would be like. I always did know that it was a good thing. I felt worried about my own weakness and the failings that I would have as a father. And I'm not a perfect father. I'm not, by any means. And, but the experience is been life-changing. And if there's one thing I would say, I don't know of very many people who actually regret having a child. For moments and at times, perhaps they may think that, but once you get, I think for women, it's right that when that child is born, and often, before the child is born, that they begin to experience that. For the man, it sometimes takes a bit longer, but there's a point at which you realize that it's a far greater deal what you get in return than what it costs you. And it does cost you. It does cost a man more work to have to be a father and to provide for a family. And it does cost a woman physically some pain and some trauma and sometimes some lasting changes and unpleasant things to have a child. But the benefits are far greater. And it's so sad that there are, there's going to be a generation of elderly people with no children to take care of them. And they're going to have they're going to have a rough time accepting the care of the state that will probably be provided for them, which is what they sought and they thought that they wanted. But to try to kind of wrap up these metaphors a bit here. The tree that does not bear fruit, that fig tree, is not necessarily its fault. If it was bred in such a way that it produces leaves and doesn't produce fruit, it couldn't control that. And if it was robbed of its ability to grow fruit because someone came and plucked off all of its buds before it had the chance to ripen, it did not have control of that either. And so, I think that it's not necessarily, that it's wrong to not produce children or to be a fruitful person in that way. But to believe the lie that protecting the tree at the cost of producing fruit is not right. And ultimately, the same thing happens to the fig tree that happens to the vine. It's cursed, and it becomes good for nothing but firewood. But to go back, I think the thing that is so fascinating is that Jesus, he redeems everything, and he even redeems the things that don't seem to have any redemption. There's nothing there to redeem. And Adam and Eve looked at the fig tree and saw that those leaves were beautiful and suitable for adornment. And fig leaves are beautiful, and they are they have been used to adorn gods, because if you look at those pictures of ancient Greece, and then their concepts, Bacchus and these gods of the gods who celebrate the lifestyle that leads to a fruitless womb, or that celebrates the act of the pleasure of reproduction, but does not desire the children. That god has as a crown an adornment of fig leaves and grape leaves, leaves of trees that are meant to bear fruit. And he's the god of the vine. But Christ has for a crown of thorns. And a thorn is not suitable for adornment because it's not beautiful, and it causes pain. But he takes something that fundamentally shouldn't even exist and does not have any purpose, and he takes that and says, this will be the thing that adorns my head and gives me glory. And as it pierces his body, it makes me think of the way that the unleavened bread, it's no yeast is added to it. So the presence of yeast, which represents the sin, is not in it. It was never put in it in the first place. But even so, it's pierced to prevent any rising from happening. If there was anything in there, the holes are produced to keep it from rising up, from being unleavened. And Christ is the bread of life, and he's pierced by these crown of thorns. And in a sense, it's the proof of his sinlessness that he's pierced and pricked by this crown. And it is now redeemed in our minds, because that's the crown that he wears. He doesn't wear a crown of gold, he doesn't wear a crown of silver, and he doesn't wear a crown of fig leaves. He wears a crown of thorns. And so even though the thorn is a disobedient plant, a plant that doesn't bear fruit, that doesn't serve a purpose, God chose to use that to adorn himself. And I think that in that sense, even those, and I've thought about this many times, my children are going to grow up and they are going to be surrounded by people who have believed lies, and those lies will have left them fruitless, infertile, because they've used chemicals or surgeries to keep themselves from being able to bear children, to be a fruitful tree in the material sense. But through a relationship with God, they can bear fruit, and they can spiritually become mothers and fathers. And the concepts that in God's, we're all born from our parents, but we're born again in Christ. And not only that, but we are adopted. It's through adoption that we become part of the family of God. And so I think that we can't, it's not an either or. It's a both and. It is wonderful and good to celebrate the act of bringing life into this world. And it is also wonderful and holy to devote yourself to God. And if you cannot do both, in whichever way is normally possible, it does not exclude you from the process. Whereas, and that's what I think is a beautiful thing, is that it's not that one is better than the other, as Judaism would have said, that marriage and family is superior to singleness, celibacy, or being a eunuch, which was sometimes intentional and sometimes not, as it is now in our current times. Nor is it the way that Christians have thought at times, where it was only the spiritual as value, and that the physical is base and dirty and not as good, because God called both things good. And I think that when we live in a way that we value both the physical life and the spiritual life, that's where God is building his kingdom. It's not of this earth, but it is of these people. And the more people there are, the more people can know him. And I think that was ultimately the vision that God gave me just about his view as a father. That it doesn't matter if it's enough for us, if we feel like we're satisfied, or if we're comfortable with where we are. We really must consider the command that God gave us, and if we're not willing to consider that option, then at least in one aspect we are being trees that bear no fruit, and that is not a good place to be. So that's a lot of thoughts on that, but hopefully it made sense, and hopefully I didn't screw anything up. Thank you.